And this is a little bit off the topic of Erik Prince, but let me just say this about President Obama's policy. In the case of Afghanistan, he's worse than President Bush when it comes to using these private forces. Obama has doubled the number of armed private contractors in Afghanistan during his presidency. There are 104,000 Department of Defense contractors right now under President Obama. There were 70,000 under President Bush. He is escalating and surging the number of private contractors, continuing to use Blackwater, but also other companies as well. Blackwater also has been investigated recently by the Senate Armed Services Committee because they set up a shell company called Paravant in Afghanistan. And they set that company up, according to Senator Carl Levin, to try to trick the US government into giving Blackwater contracts without having to say we're Blackwater. They had a company that had not existed, Paravant, for more than 3 months, according to the Senate, before they won a lucrative Iraq contract, saying they had been in business for years. And this company, 2 of their operatives, have been indicted on murder charges, federal murder charges, for killing Afghan civilians. They're also the ones that are at the center of the investigation for signing out 200 AK-47s from an arms depot in Afghanistan under the name of Eric Cartman, the character from South Park. Erik Prince's longtime number 2 man, Gary Jackson, and 4 other Blackwater executives have just been indicted on federal weapons charges. The allegations there are very serious, but it's kind of like going after Al Capone for tax evasion. But what they're alleged to have done is improperly possessed automatic weapons, and then when the ATF tried to go and investigate, they moved them from one warehouse at Blackwater's compound to the warehouse of a Blackwater subdivision, XPG, which is used for their, what they call OGA business, other government agency, CIA, JSOC, the dark side world. They thought, well, the ATF's not going to be able to go and look in there because that's the stuff that we hold for the CIA and others. There's a very, very dark situation with this company, a very dark situation. And we have not even scratched the surface of it. What chills me the most is when I talk to guys that have worked for Blackwater. They come up to me either at events or get in touch with me in other ways, and they say, I've read your book, or I heard you talk, or I saw this interview. It's much worse than you think. It's chilling to hear that from guys who have been there and done that on the front line with this company. The other thing, and this maybe is somewhat humorous, that Erik Prince said earlier this year, was that it was Blackwater and not the Secret Service that took down Muntazar al-Zaidi, the Iraqi journalist who threw his shoes at President Bush. And then this could probably get Prince in some political trouble because he said the Secret Service was flat-footed, Bush's security detail, and that Blackwater kind of swooped into the rescue and took this guy down. He called him the shoe bomber. I wasn't aware there was ever an allegation that there was a bomb there, but they, he was talking about how they took down this Muntazar al-Zaidi. The other thing is that he talked about wanting to send US forces into Nigeria, which is one of the largest oil producers in the world. This is a place, I've been there and I've reported on the situation of multinational oil corporations there in the oil-rich Niger Delta. Multinational oil corporations have committed systemic human rights abuses in Nigeria in collusion with that country's dictatorship for many, many decades. I was there myself and reported on how the Chevron Oil Corporation conspired with the Nigerian military junta in an operation that ended up killing indigenous villagers who had protested against environmental pollution in their riverine community. I went there with Amy Goodman. We interviewed the survivors of this massacre. We interviewed the head of Chevron in Nigeria who admitted to it. These oil companies have been stealing resources from Nigeria, working with corrupt officials there. When Erik Prince spoke about it, though, he said the problem is that Nigerians are stealing the oil from the oil companies. And he called them guerrilla groups with terrorist ties that were siphoning oil from the oil companies and using the proceeds to fund terrorism. He didn't provide any evidence for this, and to run criminal syndicates. And his solution is to send in private contractors to fight against these individuals. Anyone who knows the history of the African continent should ponder this. Is it really a solution to target black people on the African continent with white mercenaries? Is that something we really want to be talking about in 2010? When Erik Prince proposes sending his overwhelmingly white company's forces into a very black African nation that has had a history of white mercenaries, what is that man thinking? What he's thinking is, I'm behind closed doors, and no one's listening that would care about this, because we're all on the same page in this room. That's why he doesn't talk about such things at Tulip Time Festival, because it would actually expose them to public scrutiny. But it gives you a fascinating window into what happens when the press isn't allowed in, when the public isn't allowed in, when people that do 90% of their business with the federal government aren't held accountable. They come up with ideas like that. He also says during his speech, I get asked all the time, I don't imagine that he actually gets asked this all the time, but he said, I get asked all the time, aren't you concerned that when you operate in the likes of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, that you don't have protection under the Geneva Convention? Because there is a discussion in the legal community here about what kind of classification mercenaries or private forces have. Are they unlawful combatants? Are they enemy combatants? Do they have any protection? And he said, not at all, because the people that we're fighting in those countries are, quote, barbarians who, quote, crawled out of the sewer. Barbarians who crawled out of the sewer. And he said, they don't even know where Geneva is, let alone that there was a convention there. Now, it's fascinating that he would misuse the term or misinterpret the term convention in the context of the Geneva Convention and act as though it was just some meeting that happened in Switzerland. The Geneva Convention is a treaty that is also U.S. law, because U.S. law provides that when we ratify a treaty, it becomes part of our law. So by sort of dismissing it out of hand as something that would not apply because they're barbarians that crawled out of the sewer, shows the disregard he has for systems of laws. This is a man who ran his own assassination teams for the Central Intelligence Agency, who actually admits to having bankrolled himself operations and not been reimbursed by the government. What that means is that it's the ultimate plausible deniability machine. He was training, he says, this secret assassin force at one of his family properties on the East Coast in Virginia. And he compares himself to Valerie Plame, the CIA operative who was outed in a very vindictive act by people within the Bush administration because her husband, Ambassador Joe Wilson, wrote an op-ed blowing apart the Bush administration's lies about yellow cake uranium in the African nation of Niger. Erik Prince, you are no Valerie Plame. What Valerie Plame did is work in official government agencies. What you did was run around playing spy and hitman around the world and then complain that you're being politically attacked. It's not a political attack. It's Americans demanding accountability for U.S. taxpayer operations that are being outsourced to private companies. That's what it is. I want to leave room for us to be able to have a discussion or a dialogue or argument if someone's here. I'm open to any of that. But I want to say that at the end of the day, we can talk until we're blue in the face about the problems with Blackwater, about the problems with using particularly Erik Prince's companies. But it's not just about Blackwater. You see, Blackwater exists because of the insatiable thirst for wars that don't have popular support, for expansionist policies, for unaccountable operations that don't have to go in front of the parliaments of European nations, Congress of the United States. Why should you have to work with a coalition of the willing when you can hire a coalition of the billing? And so you have this company that is stepping in because there's a demand for its services. Erik Prince is a forward-thinking, visionary man when it comes to the war industry. This is a guy who really understands how to corner the mercenary market. And he's done an incredible job of doing just that. Now, anyone who thinks that they're going down the toilet or the tubes anytime soon hasn't been listening to those times when we have an opportunity to hear Erik Prince. He's on to the next big thing. But until we address that demand, until we look at why this government, the United States government, is in the midst of its most radical privatization agenda in history that cuts across every aspect of our society, healthcare, schools, law enforcement, prisons, military, every aspect of our life is becoming increasingly privatized. And when operations and government functions are privatized, the free marketeers say, competition is going to give us a better product. And then they give no-bid contracts to Halliburton, the least competitive contracts out there. Until we address that, until we understand the prophetic warnings of President Eisenhower when he talked about the merging of the military-industrial complex with campaign financing, when he talked about the nexus between politicians and the corporations. Pete Hoekstra knows all about that. Pete Hoekstra is about as pro-corporate of a politician as you can get. Leaks like a sieve on the Intelligence Committee, often tells things to Fox News that later turn out to be untrue. But these politicians would be nowhere without their corporate masters. And until we address that system, we aren't going to get anywhere in protecting the democratic system in this country and moving forward with any sense of a moral purpose. Thank you very much.